some of the largest global storehouse of carbon are in the boreal forest soils. We measure the peat depths in a lot of the wetlands, and it can be 30, 100 feet of peat in some of the fens.
Isn't that nuts?
Yeah.
30 to 100 feet.
Or more, yeah. Some of them have been accumulating peat for 10,000 or more years.
Hey guys, what's happening? Welcome to Your Forest. I'm Matthew Christoff. On this podcast, we talk about the environment and the science of sustainability. This podcast is a forum for people to have conversations around research and management and does not necessarily represent the views of sponsors. Today's episode is a great episode. It's all about wetlands, and I brought in, who else do you bring in to talk about wetlands other than Ducks Unlimited, right? That's who you go to. They're the ones that are doing all the best work when it comes to wetlands, and to have somebody else on just seems like a little irresponsible. So I was fortunate enough to get a hold of Ducks Unlimited Boreal program, the National Boreal program in Canada, and I managed to get on Kevin Smith, who is the manager of the National Boreal program, as well as Michael Merchant, who is the remote sensing specialist. And a shout out to Franco Allo, who set up the whole thing. And we had an awesome conversation regarding wetlands, the importance of wetlands, what kind of loss we've seen, what kind of positives, what kind of conservation efforts we have seen, what are the concerns, what are the focus, what do we need to be looking out for, all kinds of great stuff, all about, talked a bit about the partnerships, the partnerships that Duck has with, with all kinds of industry, including the forest industry. So there's all kinds of great information here about, from ecology to protection to everything. It's awesome. Very, very informative, and you guys are going to love it. I couldn't be more grateful to speak to Kevin and Michael. It was an awesome conversation. Exactly what I was hoping to get. So you guys are going to like it, definitely. And sponsors for this episode include West Fraser, as always. The last 2 years, West Fraser has been a sponsor, and without them, it wouldn't be possible to do this podcast the way I do it. And they're doing awesome work in the forest industry. They really go above and beyond to make sure that they can do everything they can within their power to be sustainable and include all values. So, I'm very, very grateful to have them as a partner. Secondary is Green Lake Forestry. They've been with me since the beginning, and again, without them, it wouldn't be possible. And so I gotta appreciate them. They're also doing good work in the forest industry. And Damaged Timber is the final sponsor. They are an apparel company coming out with some other stuff soon as well. And awesome company. 10% of everything they sell goes towards an environmental science scholarship for environmental sciences students, or if you're going to NATE or SATE or doing your tech program or whatever, check them out. They give that out every year. Damagedtimber.com. And they're an awesome company. Check them out. And that'll be it. Without further messing around, let's dive into it. Talking about wetlands, the importance of, with Ducks Unlimited, the Boreal program, National Boreal program for Canada. Here we go. A question that popped in my mind very first off when I was thinking about Ducks Unlimited, in my mind, it's a conservation organization, obviously, right? But in my mind, conservation almost always stems from a background in like hunting and that kind of stuff. Either of you guys hunters at all?
Yes, I hunt.
Waterfowl hunting, and obviously, I'm guessing.
And big game.
And big game too?
Yep.
And yourself?
Yeah, me not so much. Gaining an appreciation for it though. So seeing everyone in the company and those that do hunt, you start to get an appreciation for it.
Is it pretty common in the company for people to be?
It is. Yeah. It's not a prerequisite for employment, however.
I figured maybe it should be.
I might not be here then.
Well, you got to start, right? You
just being open to it, right?
Yeah, for sure. Okay, cool. Awesome. Yeah, no, I thought that was... In my mind, most of those conservation organizations, they tend to stem, it seems like they stem from that kind of a background, right? And so it's good to see that there's still people doing it. It's good. I've never actually waterfowl hunted. It's something that I really wanted to do. It's just I haven't had the privilege of doing it yet. So
it's a lot of fun, but it's we have a lot of history on waterfowling and things like that. But we also have a lot of supporters that are birders or conservationists in general, or
for sure.
On the environmental side, a range, right?
Yeah, so for sure. No, that's awesome. It's I don't know. That's just where that's where my love of the outdoors and all that started from as a kid. Well, both my parents are foresters, so that, but also hunting and fishing and all that kind of stuff. So it's, I just wanted to get that out there.
Yeah,
so
cool. What kind of hunting have you done?
Me mostly like grew up in Slave Lake, so mostly big game, mostly like whitetail, moose, elk, that kind of stuff, and then grouse. But that's pretty much it. Like there's definitely a wider range of stuff to get into. I just tried. My sister's boyfriend has a hunting dog, and over Christmas we decided to go for a walk with the hunting dog for grouse or whatever. We didn't end up getting anything, but it was a cool experience, and I had never done that, so it's pretty neat. Yeah, I like that. Definitely am open to trying new stuff. I mean, I put in for turkeys whenever the draw comes up and bison, but you never get those. So
it's a little harder.
Yeah, a little tough. Yeah. So I guess we should start off just with like introducing you guys. So if you guys don't mind, just giving you a quick little intro, who you are, where you came from, and then maybe just why you got into this work. Like, what is it about wetlands that, decided to put your whole life into it?
Sure.
So start with you.
Sure. Why not? Yeah. So my name is Michael Merchant. I'm the remote sensing lead for the Boreal program. I've been with the program for coming up to close to 5 years now. Man, time flies. Yeah, it flies. But I came from Southern Ontario. I grew up just outside Toronto in the GTA.
Okay.
But really where my kind of love and passion for wetlands came from was just doing grad school. My research was on wetland mapping in a small nutshell, but a northern boreal wetland mapping. So finished school, did a couple contracts, etc., and then I saw this position open. It was like kind of read my resume, right?
Yeah.
So
for sure.
It fit perfectly, and 5 years later, I'm here doing wetland mapping.
Nice,
going strong.
That's awesome.
Okay.
Yourself?
Kevin Smith. I'm the national manager of Boreal programs for Ducks Unlimited Canada, and I've been with DU for about 20 years.
Okay.
It'll be 20 years here in June. And I have always had a passion for wetlands. In grad school and undergrad, I did work in the Everglades and across wetlands across North America doing research. Did a lot of satellite remote sensing and mapping of wetlands, those types of things. So always been interested in. And they had a fun, I think, job announcement around 20 years ago, flying in helicopters and looking at wetlands across northern Canada, and really developed a passion since then, and have been excited about the Boreal and wetlands ever since.
Yeah, that's awesome. Mm-hmm. So when it originally started when you were a kid? Was it through hunting and that kind of stuff, or was it something else? When you first started, like, what was the first initial time that you were like, oh yeah, wetlands, that's my thing?
Well, I grew up on a farm in the U.S. and we had lots of wetlands, and it was, as a kid, just kind of traipsing through and seeing all the different wildlife and things like that. And
for sure.
Place to play and be and experience nature, I guess.
Awesome. Yeah. Good stuff. And then getting into ducks. So before we get into talking about the importance of wetlands and all that kind of stuff, let's just get through the nitty gritty of Ducks Unlimited. And how did that start? Do you know, or first of all, I guess with the Boreal program, you've been around 20 years. Is that the entire whole life of the Boreal program? Or?
Almost. The Boreal program started in 1997.
Okay.
Within Ducks Unlimited. Ducks Unlimited Canada itself has been around since 1938.
Right.
So for a long time, the Boreal was kind of a secondary thought. And then around the late 90s, started to really understand the importance of waterfowl in the Boreal. And now it's, we know it's around 40% of the breeding population for all of the waterfowl in North America come out of the Boreal. So pretty important place for a company to develop conservation pieces around. So
yeah, for sure. So in the 1938, you said, so the first little while was mostly regarding like around agriculture and the white zone and around cities and that kind of stuff? Or
the concern of loss of wetlands, particularly in the southern and prairie landscapes.
Yeah.
lots of areas in the kind of the Dust Bowl era. You know, we're losing wetlands rapidly, and hunters banded together, conservationists banded together, and said, "Well, we got to do something about this." And so they developed a lot of habitat restoration, conservation easement programs, that type of things.
That makes sense.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's kind of what I figured. I mean, that's where people are. That's where they're going to notice that there's problems, right? So,
exactly.
Yeah.
Whereas in the north, wetlands are largely intact. There's some impacts on wetlands there that I'm sure we'll talk about, but a different opportunity in the north to kind of conserve what we have now, which is incredible. And so we developed a program around that.
Gotcha. So you guys focus in the Boreal programs, focus specifically on the Boreal. You're not focusing on like the white zone around cities and stuff like that as much?
Right. Yeah.
Okay.
Just the 1.4 billion acres of the Boreal.
There's a lot of land there to work with.
Oh yeah, no, for sure. I was just trying to get a capture of the scope. So you're not so Ducks Canada is probably dealing with the stuff in the white zone. Then I would assume.
Yeah. So we work in every province and territory across Canada, and have provincially based programs in terms of conservation delivery.
Gotcha.
So we're the one program that kind of spans more of an ecological zone within Canada, the north, the Boreal zones, as a program. So a little bit different there. And the other difference is that our program focuses on influence. So public policy, conservation policy, practices with industry, working directly with industry and indigenous governments and researchers. So it's a more public land type approach.
Right, for sure. And that's a big, it's funny how it's interesting how in the last 5 to 10 years, the whole idea of public land has exploded, and people have really grabbed onto that notion of public land, right? And seems like it's just becoming more of a value in society, right? Like people are starting to be like, okay, this is something we need to think about, right? Which is it's awesome. It's good.
Yeah, for sure.
Yep.
So, what would you guys attribute the success of Ducks to, the Boreal program and all that kind of stuff? I mean, regards to, I would assume it's partnerships and getting it all, getting the right kind of people to communicate with. But what do the partnerships look like? Who are you guys all involved with?
Yeah, I think our approach is solutions oriented, partnership based to start with, right? So we naturally partner with industry, and ever since the beginning of the Boreal program, we've had very strong partnerships with forest companies,
right?
In particular,
okay.
Also oil and gas and other industries as well. But really have developed a lot of programs together because we have a lot of common interests on the forestry side.
For sure.
Sustainable forest management, all of those types of things, the practices and principles around that. We work a lot around that. So it's, and we also work a lot, we're a science-based organization. So we work a lot with researchers to figure out some of the knowledge gaps in the Boreal, but also what practices to kind of do on the landscape that are sustainable.
Yeah, for sure. Well, it makes sense, right? The work, you guys aren't doing work on the landscape besides doing the conservation efforts. So you want to make sure that the people who are, making roads and cut blocks and well sites, they're doing it in a way that's going to minimize the impact. Right? Yeah, that makes sense. Yeah. Perfect. That's great. So that's been going well for the entirety of the Boreal program. It's been a pretty strong partnership there. That's awesome.
Yeah.
Yeah. That's good. That's good. I mean, I would assume so, but it's good to know because you just get people, people worry about the big bad corporation all the time, right? It's just that big black box and everyone's worried that they're just taking everything and running, right? So it's good. It's just, I like to point out the fact that all these corporations that are, whether it's oil and gas or forestry or whatever, it's there may be things that we disagree upon, but it's they're all people and they all give a shit, right? They're trying to do what's right, the same as everybody else, right?
Yeah, so for sure. And we kind of look for benefits on both sides, right? So you kind of brought up the fact that we're working or well received with forestry and we work quite a lot with them. And you think of road development, for example, right? Mm-hmm. If you're constructing the best road possible with regards to mitigation on hydrology and other impacts on the landscape, that's going to be less economic cost for the company down the road, right? So there's a win-win on both. Totally. Conservation through important landscapes and then an economic value too. Yeah, of course. Exactly. That's I was going to get to that later, but it's interesting that I think a lot of us are starting to recognize that if we can start to put that sustainable
ecological value into the model, into the industrialized model, it's better for industry in the long run as well.
Exactly.
Ultimately, it's better, but there was some short-sightedness, I guess. And when we first started taking the land base apart and trying to, extract things from it. So now I think we started to recognize where that gap is. So it's good. Yeah,
for sure.
Awesome.
Mm-hmm.
So we can get into the wetlands now, I guess, just specifically, right? So why are wetlands important? Basically, I guess what I want to say is why should the public, the general public, care about wetlands?
I don't know if we have enough time.
Yeah, I know, right? We're going to get through it. We'll just the cliff notes for now, and then we'll get through it. We got time.
Yeah, no, for sure. I mean, there's a whole list of things we can kind of go back and forth, but you think of flood mitigation is a huge one. Like you turn on the news and how many huge economic impact floods we're seeing across the country, right?
Yep.
And you see a lot of regions, the impacts of loss of wetlands that plays a huge role in that, for just maintaining balance in the hydrology of the landscape, right?
Yeah.
So I mean, that's one of the first big ones that come to mind. We're going to touch a lot about carbon. Another thing, turn on the news and what do you see everywhere? It's climate change, right?
Yep.
And we see wetlands, especially in the north, these what we call peatlands. They've been storing peat for thousands of years, and they're basically mitigating impacts on climate change, right? So another big one that's of why wetlands are important. Yeah. To us, waterfowl, it's huge to us, but also that's not the only thing using wetlands, right? There's you name it, a huge list of mammals and species that are using wetlands. So you see a lot of biodiversity in them that's surrounding and using them. So yeah, I mean the list kind of goes on, but those are some of the three big ones that come to my mind. For sure.
And I think when people think wetlands, a lot of times, like myself included, up until I started forestry, they think just like, okay, there's a slough, a pond with some ducks and some cattails or whatever. That's a wetland, right? And I think a lot of times people forget that there's also just the wetland treat ecosystems, right? The bogs and the fens and I can speak anecdotally from my profession, from mapping the forest. I can tell you that a bare minimum of the boreal forest is going to be at least like 35% wetland when it comes to the actual treed fens and bogs and all that kind of stuff. So it's a huge part of that ecosystem, moving nutrients, moving water, and but that's the part that I think is because I mean, people look at agricultural, a farm or something like that, right? And they go, oh, that used to be a little divot, used to be probably a pond of some kind, and now it's all dried out, and that was a lost wetland, right? Yeah. But they don't recognize that maybe that whole farmland at one point used to be a rich fen or something like that, right? And the whole thing was really a wetland, and it could have been, so it's interesting to note that those are things that we've kind of lost track of. But yeah. The flood one's interesting too. So can you explain why preservation of wetlands, like why, if we had those wetlands, so why would that mitigate floods?
Yeah, well, it'd be essentially they work as buffers for storing water, right? And if you don't have that system there to store water when you have your maximum flooding extents, excuse me, we're a little cold myself too, right? But if you don't have that buffer there, and in certain regions, you're just seeing complete, especially more in the southern regions, you see wipeout of wetland extent. There's just not that buffer there for when you have those maximum events, right? Right. And then we're seeing with, for example, climate change, more larger rain events, etc. And without these buffers, it's just kind of a recipe for
think of them as big sponges, right? Yeah. So if you take out that sponge and there's a big rain event, then all that flows downstream, and then you get greater floods. They also excuse me, I guess I'm getting a cold too.
I think we're all running colds right now. Minus 30 will do that.
Filter a lot of nutrients too. So if you think of in Manitoba, Lake Winnipeg, and the algae blooms and things like that, a lot of the nutrients that normally would have been filtered out in the wetlands are flowing right into Lake Winnipeg and things like that. And we've done a lot of research as a company on the importance of wetlands within a watershed perspective. Sure. One wetland, and then when it becomes 1,000 wetlands, it really changes the hydrodynamics of the whole region, and you get a lot more flooding, nutrient exchange, that type of thing. So
I didn't realize that about the algae blooms. That's what we're that's what we're thinking causes that. Is that it's just the increased amount of nutrients being poured into the lake that's causing the algae blooms? So
well, it goes straight into the lake, whereas before, when you had the wetlands to kind of filter out the phosphorus and the nitrogen and all those other kind of added pieces to the crops and fields, it provided a buffer, not just water, but the nutrients flowing in the streams to the lake. And so there's a connection there. That we've done some research and partnered with researchers on to figure out some of those dynamics.
Okay, that makes sense. Yeah, no, I didn't know that. That's interesting. So what's the concern there? What is having more algae in like a lake? What is the problem there?
Well, there's a lot of issues.
Right.
Basically, it's water quality, right?
Okay.
So, if you're swimming or, some of the impacts on fisheries, if it gets too extensive, a lot of those types of things that,
Gotcha.
People want nice, clean lakes to fish in and play in. And,
Yep.
that nobody wants to go to a beach that's, sloshing up green algae on their feet. Nobody's going to go swimming there. So it's about water quality primarily.
Gotcha. Okay, and that causes a lot of problems with like filtration and that kind of stuff too, I'm assuming. And
Yeah.
so the algae and like fish habitat, is the algae just like what is the concern there? Just quickly, I don't want to go down a rabbit hole with this one, but
yeah, no, I think it changes the oxygen in the lake and things like that, and it can limit the life history of the fish.
Okay. And this is beyond what we know as like historical norms then of having like algae in the lakes.
Greater blooms.
Yeah. Okay. Interesting. Do you see that that was mostly in Ontario, you were saying, but do we see that in lakes in northern Alberta as well as a result of like oil and gas and forestry exploration, that kind of stuff? Or?
Well, historically, the lakes in Alberta had high levels of nutrients, kind of historically. So then, if you add on to that, it's a lot of the lakes around here, with added input, have added algae in earlier and more extensive blooms than probably they would have had in the past. So
for sure. I'm sure climate change all plays into that too, which is a nice, fun rolling ball that just continues. Yeah, for sure. Okay, interesting. So ecosystem services is a big one, and then
recreation, like
recreation, all that kind of stuff.
Wildlife habitat.
Yep,
and carbon storage and sequestration too. So
of course,
some of the largest global storehouse of carbon are in the boreal forest soils. We measure the peat depths in a lot of the wetlands, and it can be 100 feet of peat in some of the fens.
Isn't that nuts?
Yeah.
30 to 100 feet
or more. Yeah, some of them have been accumulating peat for 10,000 or more years.
Isn't that wild? Like since glaciation, basically. It's just like wow. That's wild to think about. What does peat look like at 100 feet down? It just must look like soil at that point. Like
it's organic. It looks like the bales of peat that you buy from the home and garden
peat extraction stuff. Yeah.
But some of it's further down a little bit, less oxygen.
Right.
Yeah.
That's wild to think that that's something that you can only have after that amount of time, right? Like that's something that you need that timeline to actually build that up.
Yeah,
exactly.
Yeah. And that's got to be just in and of itself hugely important for filtration and all kinds of stuff down the line, right? Like without those peat lands, I'm sure our water filtration costs go through the roof, and all kinds of extra algae and all kinds of so that's interesting.
Peat lands are also great filters of heavy metals.
Oh yeah,
like mercury, selenium. A lot of those get bound in the organic soils and not passed out into the stream, right?
Interesting. That's wild. Yeah, that's definitely, it makes you wonder about like the peat extraction stuff, right? Like I know nothing about peat extraction or whether it's, can be done sustainably or whatever. I know nothing about it, but it just definitely makes you question that, right?
Like, we work quite a bit with the Canadian Sphagnum Peat Moss Association, and they work in a very sustainable manner. So it does eventually grow up. They restore it at the end of the extraction, and the actual footprint of that is very small.
Oh, that's awesome.
Compared to the entire, storehouse of carbon in the boreal. It's a very small
sure.
amount, and so we partner directly with a lot of those
That's
groups
awesome.
and companies just to develop some of the practices and partner on a lot of the research on the restoration of bogs and fens.
That's awesome.
Which is a little bit harder than just digging a hole and putting water in it.
Yeah, no kidding, right?
A little bit different than the south, right?
Yeah.
So how do they go about how do you do sustainable peat extraction? So they're just removing kind of the top layer that only takes a few years to kind of come
so
back,
they would drain the hydrology.
Yeah.
And then they have these really neat kind of operators that look like big vacuums that go across and suck up the peat.
Yeah.
And then after they're done, then they restore the hydrology and usually take there are different techniques that they can do to restore the bogs and fens, but typically involves taking kind of plant material from existing bogs that they're not harvesting and transplanting some of that to speed the growth of the the peat and all the woody vegetation that comes on that restores that peatland over time. Gotcha. It takes time. I mean, it's a very slow process, but if you look at it from a longer term perspective, it's a temporary extraction and then regrowth, rebuilding of those bogs and fens.
So very similar to forestry in that fashion, in that they're looking at the sustainability over time. Probably like forestry does a 200-year time horizon. I'm sure peat moss folk are probably doing a 4,000-year time horizon or something.
A little bit longer, but but still sustainable.
Yeah, oh, that's cool. That's very cool. Yeah, I never really thought about that. But that's interesting. So when it comes to the situation regarding wetlands in Canada and Alberta or whatever, however you want to put it, what is, like, let's say, do we know what the historical norms were, like pre-colonization or something like that, before we started to develop everything, and where do we sit now in relation to that? Ooh. Tough one, I know.
Yeah.
You speak.
It depends on where. So I don't know that we have exact numbers because we don't have an exact picture of the true extent of historical wetlands.
Of course not. Strangely, there was no cameras back in 1600. Yes.
But the program that Michael leads is mapping wetlands. So figuring out what's there now.
Sure.
And there have been a lot of losses I think in some areas in southern Alberta it can be 80-90%, whereas in the green zone it can be a lot lower, like 10 to 20-30% kind of in some of the more working landscapes. And in a lot of those in the boreal, it's not really loss, it's temporary roads going through or temporary harvest of peatlands.
Sure.
And so it's we don't have exact numbers, but there's been quite a bit of wetland loss in the white zone.
Yeah. I mean, it makes sense when you look at just development in general, as humans do.
Yeah. And if you think, Kevin was making note of the program that I lead, the remote sensing of wetlands for the Boreal program. In doing so, we rely on satellite data, right? And much of our satellite or commonplace satellite technology dates back to the early 80s. Before that, but basically what was started being open to researchers in public and et cetera. So most of our analysis of looking at historical change can go back to about those times, the 70s, 80s, 90s, right?
Gotcha.
So it's difficult to say what was the norm relative to, back to the 20s, 30s, 40s. But in the southern region, and we do work closely, myself in particular, with the Prairie program at times and in tech development and such. But, I've seen some interesting historical changes where there's air photos, right? So you use air photos and then relate back to current air photos or satellite imagery. Yep. And with drainage and impacts, it's can be quite staggering in the south. Not the same impacts in the north, just because it's a different landscape. But
there are some old air photos. Like there's some air photos of like 1940 that you can get, right? But even then, we're still been developing for however 100 years already, right?
Yeah,
so it's,
for sure. And boreal wetlands are very difficult to to identify from even current satellite technology, but air photos as well. Yeah. But like you were saying, in the south, you can the wetland types you commonly see there. You can see them, and they're open. They're marshes. You can delineate them well from air photos. Boreal wetlands are a quite different challenge when you think of, you're talking about treed systems, right? Treed bogs, treed fens. So you're kind of seeing a forest across the landscape, whereas much of that is wetland and upland. It's difficult, right? So
For sure.
I'm just picking apart at the difficulties sometimes, but of remote sensing. But there's definitely his impacts, but quite different across the north and south.
Interesting. Yeah. So what when you're doing wetlands mapping, right? So walk me through that process. What do you like? Because I know there's a bunch of different ways to do it, right? People use LiDAR, they use aerial photography, they use. What's the current system? What's the latest and greatest wetland mapping?
Oh, latest and greatest. Yeah. Like you said, LiDAR, which is laser technology. It's kind of really fascinating how it's becoming the you're seeing it in news or all different applications for archaeological applications, etc. Forestry is a big one. It's really the gold standard for mapping, but it's not always easy to obtain for such large operational regions that we work at.
Yeah, for sure.
So because of that, and it usually has to be airborne. So expensive to fly a plane to fly to acquire that, right? So we rely mostly on satellite technology.
Gotcha.
Optical satellite images. They're taken systematically across the earth, and we rely on them. Yeah. And it's kind of
and it's pretty low resolution too, right? It's like 30-meter resolution or something like that.
Relatively, yeah. So if you're thinking of averaging something on the landscape at a 10-meter or 30-meter resolution, that's essentially what you're dealing with. Yeah. So you get a good average across the landscape, right? And it allows you to basically map across the regions that we're mapping when we're doing large regions across the Boreal. So in a nutshell, it's acquiring that imagery, doing a whole bunch of processing on it, running it through some computer programs that identify land cover types in that imagery, so wetlands and uplands, and we'll do a process of essentially QCing it at the end. So that's in a nutshell, but we'll talk about some of our projects later actually, and kind of give you an example of what those timescales look like.
For sure. Yeah, Michael's last project was 77 million acres. So when you think about trying to do that with LiDAR and air photos, that becomes an insurmountable task at some point.
It's a lot of data.
So it's a lot easier to have a common platform across a large area like a satellite when it takes a picture of what's going on in the landscape, and provides a lot of different information in the different wavelengths. The visible but infrared and near infrared and things like that, and that picks up different signatures from the vegetation and allows us to map wetlands across extensive landscapes.
No, for sure. Have you guys ever looked into like for example, here we do mostly AVI, so Alberta Vegetation Inventory, right? I look at air photos and LiDAR all day long, just delineating and interpreting stuff, right? Have you guys ever talked to like the government and forest companies about getting those? Like, I don't know what the legality is around getting those inventories or whatever, but like we go through them now, and you tag them all with wet, and we even put ecosites on them now, right? So it's got the nutrient and the moisture regime or whatever. Have you guys ever been able to acquire any of that information? Because it would get you pretty specific cover types and all kinds of stuff, right?
Yeah, a lot of the forest companies that we partner with, we they give us access to those data sets, and then we in many cases we've merged those so that the attributes of our classifications really looking at wetlands and the more ecological parts of the landscape, whereas theirs are focusing on, they're better delineated in the upland, the forest zones.
Sure.
So combining those data sets can be a quite good product to figure out, for planning or operations and things like that. So, yeah, it's a good, because it's air photo interpreted, it's also, it's more of a polygons with lines going through, and ours is more raster based, so it's square pixels that go across. So, you have to develop the techniques to kind of merge those, but they have been used by several of our partners to figure out where wetlands are and to plan and do operations around that.
Yeah. And they're great products.
Sure.
But it's kind of bringing light to just the different techniques of mapping where, it's a delineation by an analyst. rather than running it through a program. So you can imagine just the time differences between it, right? And you're
oh God, yeah. I couldn't expect you guys to pay to get your own imagery flown for the whole country, right? And then try to delineate. Like, no, it's not. That's what I was saying. We can collaborate with. Sure. You guys say you have collaborations with a bunch of industry and that kind of stuff. I would assume that there would be some. You know what I mean? You could collaborate that way a lot and get more detail, right? So
certainly you can use a product like that to basically stratify another analysis, right?
Right.
But yeah, merging of products is quite a big thing, and I think just to put into you know, in a nutshell, but remote sensing is kind of balancing what your application is, right? So that'll guide you to your technology in your process of developing a map of whatever you're trying to map, right?
Yeah, for sure, totally makes sense. So when you're going through and mapping out, like, for your job, right? You're doing you're mapping wetlands and that kind of stuff. What is the major concern, and like what is the goal? What are you trying to aim at? Because I would assume by now that there's been a multitude of number of wetland maps that have been created or whatever, right? So so what are you guys aiming towards doing? What are you trying to accomplish?
Yeah, probably two things I'd point to. One being ecologically relevant. So we want to be able to identify these very detailed wetland types that, for the most part, we're one of the only groups that does this across Canada. We're quite unique in that sense.
Yeah.
Not just mapping wetlands or boreal wetlands, but it's to the detail that we map to that really, you know, where our wetland products are looked at as kind of the gold standard of wetland mapping. But that's really a lot of where our focus is being able to extract those very detailed wetland types.
Yeah. So
you can look at the extraction of land cover types or wetland types, and also the accuracy. That's basically your what you're looking for in a product is a certain accuracy,
right?
And so we have I guess workflows to assess our products, right, using data that we've collected in the field, so we can have a good at least understanding of how accurate our products are before we distribute to partners and people who are using the products.
Oh, okay.
And it's nice because it's not just a wetland map. It's a good wetland map, but it's also, you can use it to do things like model bison habitat or model waterfowl habitat if you're particularly interested in that, or how much carbon is out there on the landscape, and you can infer that from the data that we have, and so there are a lot of different uses. Hydrologic connectivity, a bunch of things that you can do with the data set once you have the wetland information.
Right. Okay.
It really feeds a lot of the program.
Yeah.
Right? So
of course you have to know what's out there in order to know what you're going to do, right?
Yeah. Whether it's science or modeling or many of the things that Kevin just noted.
Yeah.
The basis is having that land cover data first, so you can get to the next steps.
Right. Yeah.
And we partner with a lot of groups, including Indigenous communities and governments, that use the data for land use planning, land relationship planning, different uses that are increasing quite a bit across the Boreal.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, as time goes on, we're only going to be out there more and more, I imagine, right? That's the history of it, right? People, we like to expand.
Yeah, for sure.
So just to dial back just a second, I want to talk about just the white zone just a little bit, just to kind of get some ideas of what the concerns, like the major concerns are there, because it seems like we have a lot of land conversion, right? Like, or we had a lot of land conversion. I'm sure we still do. So going from, I'm sure when we first colonized this area, right, we were going through and we're thinking, okay, we convert this useless wetland into good farmland or into a city or into whatever, right? And it was seen as productivity and doing well. And then slowly over time, we're starting to recognize, like we were speaking about before, the lost value there, right? And how we're slowly starting to kind of hurt ourselves by doing that kind of stuff. So what, because you were saying there was you don't know the exact number. You said 80-90%. A lot of the wetlands
some areas, in
the white zone has been lost, right?
Yeah.
So I'm guessing there's a lot of work being done to try and bring some of those back. What does that relationship look like? Are you guys working with a lot of landowners, a lot of that kind of stuff to try and, is it mostly around trying to show them how they can have a productive, agricultural landscape as well as the wetland, or what's the relationship there like?
Yeah, we have a lot of programs where we do work with landowners, farmers, ranchers that are particularly interested in conservation and wetlands and are starting, to
sure.
think about that in a broader perspective. There's intense pressures from the economic side, given some of the commodity prices, to develop as much land as possible. But on the other side, we have some programs where we develop things like conservation easements on properties. We, wetland mitigation, wetland basically replacement on the landscape, where we go in and our engineers build the wetlands, and then they manage them over time to ensure that the function of the wetland, continues. And so we have a bunch of these programs that are actively putting land, wetlands back on the landscape, and restoring quite a bit. And we have lots of partners that work with us on that.
So basically, trying to, like you said, they have like these farmers. They're working their ass off just to try and make ends meet a lot of times.
Yes.
So if they're told like I have to lose 30% of my land base to a wetland, it's going to be hard when they can't put bread on the table or whatever. So how do you go about making it easy for them to do that? How does that work? Do you create a situation where like maybe the government doesn't tax them on that land, or like, I don't know, like how can you, somebody who's having a hard time economically, how do you allow them to have the room to value something like wetlands? You know what I mean?
Yeah. So I think, one of the programs that we have is that we purchase properties. We generate income from a number of sources to purchase properties, and then restore the wetland, put a conservation easement on it. Yeah. And then we can resell the land. And so the upland areas could then be reused as, by ranchers, or even crop, as long as they're not draining the wetland. They can still,
Gotcha.
do all the agricultural pieces, but also have those sustainable parts of the landscape where the wetlands still exist, and help with the water levels and all those types of things in that area. So it's a bit of a balance, and it's a incentive program, because the farmer gets compensation for basically keeping those wetlands on the landscape.
Right. And I imagine there's probably benefits to them as well, like you guys were talking about earlier about like flooding and that kind of stuff too, right? Like direct benefits that they may reap over time, I suppose, right? I mean, you look at places like Calgary and High River, right? When they had the big flood, when was that again? 2015 or
about then?
Yeah, a few years back there, right? Where a lot of the communities had flooded out, and I'm guessing that we can probably attribute a lot of that to a loss of wetlands along those river systems. I'm assuming, right?
Yeah. So, and we have a program with the Alberta government where we're putting wetlands back on the landscape in flood zones that will help mitigate those floods. So it's part of it, and the insurance industry is really behind this too.
I was going to say they probably have a big amount of money going into that.
Yeah, because there's less, the risk is reduced if you have more wetlands on the landscape from flood damage, and so they have less claims and things like that. So it's a good program for them as well.
Yeah. So we've been talking a little bit about the reclaiming these wetlands or rebuilding these wetlands, right? What does that look like? How do you go about rebuilding a wetland? Like, especially, let's start with like the agriculture area, right? So talking about just, I'm assuming you dig a pit, you put some water in it, and bring in some seeds and let stuff take off. But is that what that is? Kind of, more or less?
For the most part, yeah. So we have engineered wetlands where,
I'm sure it's more complicated than what I just said.
We figure out where the full supply levels of water should be.
Yeah.
And, basically work with the farmer and locals so that there's, that it's where it originally was, and they basically agree to that level.
Gotcha.
And then we'll build a dike or a dam, or there's different types of ways that you can do that, but you're basically bringing the water level back to where it was. And then in a lot of instances, the natural vegetation, the seeds of a lot of those aquatic vegetation remain in the soil. And in some cases, we do plant native vegetation. We have a whole program on the fee-for-service arm of Ducks Unlimited that does native plant solutions, they're called, that works with native plants, putting those back in, working with, those are more in like suburban communities that have stormwater ponds and wetlands that they'll redo or put the vegetation in. But it is more complicated to restore, forested wetlands. So we're working with researchers at the University of Laval and other places to figure out how do you restore a bog, how do you restore a fen, because these things grow over a lot more, 10,000 years or so, so it's restoring the vegetation and the hydrology and starting to understand the processes. And then there's another wetland type called swamps, which are a little bit even more complicated. So there's usually less peat in them and more mineral soils. Mm-hmm. They kind of occur in the boundaries of wetlands and uplands and in riparian areas. But they're particularly hard to reclaim too. And the state of the knowledge around that is not as advanced as, say, we've been putting marshes back on the landscape for, over 70, 80 years. So yeah. So we have a lot of experience there, but in forested wetlands, we're still gaining that knowledge.
One step at a time. But yeah, it is pretty incredible when you look at like urban areas and the wetlands that do manage to be created, right? Like they're pretty good at it. Like you can take something that, you totally construct a brand new housing area, and all of a sudden you've got this nice little wetland with I've seen, there's blue herons, there's ducks, there's everything up in there, right? So like that one seems like you said, you've gotten pretty successful, pretty good at rebuilding those. Mm-hmm. So when it comes to those forested wetlands and those boreal wetlands, right? Like you're saying, it's difficult to try to rebuild those. How much of that has been have those been lost the same way? Like, I mean, obviously not to the same extent, but through development, the same as like the stuff in the white zone, like those.
There have been some losses, where permanent roads and things go through. Forestry, when they go through, they largely operate. Well, especially now with sustainable forest management practices, operate around wetlands, not usually through them. And so if there are impacts, then they pull the road out. They would restore the hydrology and things like that.
I suppose that's my question. What is the problem? Like, what is the concern with the boreal wetlands? Like, what is the major? Is it roads going right through the middle that stops the flow of water, or what's the like? What are the holdups there?
Yeah, it depends on what you're looking at, right? Okay. So caribou are very sensitive to roads and seismic and things like that of fragmenting the landscape and providing easy access for predators. Yeah. Waterfowl are a little bit more resilient, so you do need to maintain the hydrology in those areas. But in a lot of the, say, seismic lines, the older seismic lines, there's a lot of work that's been done recently to kind of restore those. And there's a lot of good work from areas around Edmonton, like Nate, and they have a very good program on that, and others, McEwen, that U of A, that are really looking into, okay, how do we restore these seismic lines? So, it's kind of the cumulative seismic and roads and things like that with fragmentation of habitat.
Okay, so just you're talking more vegetation level than like peat moss level right now. Right. Yeah. Okay. Yeah. I just had the previous episode I did was with Scott Nielsen.
Oh, okay.
From the ACE Lab. So so people do listen to the podcast continuously. They'll go to that one and then this one, and it'll work out nicely.
Yeah, we've worked with him on a couple of projects in Northwest Alberta.
Right, I imagine so. Yeah. So do we come across situations in the boreal where we have something that, like you said, where we have maybe a loss of peatlands or something like that, where you have to like start from scratch, or it's never gone that far?
Oh, it has. That's a smaller amount than, say, the white zone, right?
Sure.
So it's where you would, like I said, put roads or a semi-permanent infrastructure or things like that.
Okay.
The thing about the boreal is really we're trying to do a balance of protection and sustainable development to kind of keep what we have, but also to make sure that the ecological processes that are so important remain.
Wiser working landscape, I suppose. Yeah.
So in the working landscape, it's about, how do we build better roads? And so we have, a program with the Evergreen Learning Center in Grand Prairie where the best practices that are being developed on how you cross a wetland, you can actually go there and see how that's done and walk through it and get a firsthand experience of that. So it's a lot about closing the knowledge gap, figuring out what those practices are, and then a balance of protecting the areas that are still out there and remain, and are perhaps of less economic interest and more ecological interest or cultural interest.
Yeah.
So having that balance, then you can have that economic extraction from the vast resources that are in the Boreal to make sure you have healthy northern economies and also environment at the same time.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, there's no reason why we shouldn't be able to have a working landscape and sustainable environmental ecological situation, right? Like it just needs to be done with a little bit of forethought and just in the right way. We can definitely do it, right? And it's in everybody's interest, like you guys said, right?
Yeah. And our, Kevin was kind of alluding to, we have our best management practice team with our Boreal program,
right?
And it's about maybe 6 years old or so within the Boreal program that we've kind of had this fantastic group, leading these initiatives of how to work best on the landscape, right? And
sure,
we've seen the growth of the Evergreen Center in Grand Prairie, Alberta, and it's just fantastic demonstrations where they're working with industry to showcase what works the best in different wetland types, different upland types, etc.
Okay,
and how to think and work better on the landscape, right? And we're seeing a lot of really good uptake from that from industry with our best management practices.
I believe it. There's a lot of interest in, like, what I mean? Like everyone wants to do what is right.
Yeah.
Right. There's a lot. I think there's a lot of misconception in the public that like extraction industries are just out there to get theirs and get out. But it's like, no, these people are there because they care and they want to make sure that this is done properly. And any new information is going to be absorbed information. For
exactly.
Sure.
Yeah.
And we have some pretty creative initiatives too. We have a forest management wetland stewardship initiative with multiple forest companies where we kind of band resources and knowledge and experience together to come up with solutions.
That's awesome. So actually I heard about that a little while ago and I wanted to ask you guys about that. So you're working specifically with forest industry to try and figure out better ways for them to do stuff. So what kind of stuff are you guys coming up with?
Guiding principles around forest management.
Okay.
The practices that are important to sustain wetlands on the landscape. There's another program around incidental take of waterfowl. So that would be if you harvest at kind of the wrong times, you can impact the waterfowl there's cavity nesters in the forest and things. So we work on programs around all of that too. Healthy waterfowl populations and healthy wetlands and a bunch of projects. And we had a 3-year project that just ended this year, and now we've kind of signed on with the same companies and the Forest Products Association of Canada to expand for another 3 years and answer some of the questions that we have collectively.
That's
it's
awesome.
Really neat
that
program and great partners
that
are working with us on that. And that's been a lot of fun for our team and I think important for the forest companies and in the business that they do every day.
Absolutely. No, totally. They want to make sure that they can continue to do this in a way that's not going to negatively impact other values for sure. Yeah. Right. So it's one of the big ones. Like I had Mark Heckbird on talking about trumpeter swans a while back. Yep. And he was speaking about the same thing about the timing of harvesting, right, being a problem for trumpeter swans, right? And if you can do it outside of that, I think it was the nesting period, then that all of a sudden it's no longer an issue, right? But it's I'm guessing there's a bunch of other species that have a similar problem with that.
Well, waterfowl,
just in general.
during breeding, songbirds, there's a bunch of different. I think it has to be a bit of a balance because it can be the winter harvest is become more frequent practice in forestry, which is great for us as long as it's they can get there in the winter, right? Because less impact on wetlands, things like that. It's easier for them to go through the forest, but if the freeze up occurs later and earlier in the spring, then they have a shorter period. So
which is the case with climate change.
We're constantly working with forest companies to develop solutions and try to figure that out because it is challenging because they do need to go in and harvest the trees. So
no, it is tough for sure. Yeah. So when is I'm guessing most waterfowl or just all birds in general, I'm assuming it's all in the spring, right? That they're doing their nesting, breeding. Yeah. So when at what point are they? Like I'm just trying to figure out where does that risk go down? Like at what point in the summertime is it all of a sudden less of a problem to be in there doing whatever it is, seismic activity or harvesting or whatever.
Yeah, so the breeding period is fairly, June-ish,
Sure.
depending on, when the spring thaws and things like that. But then there's the brood rearing kind of patch in the summer, and then staging in the fall when they're getting ready to fly down. But the most critical period is the early May, June kind of period where they're breeding.
Gotcha. Okay.
Because they won't breed or settle on an area if it's if there's a lot of noise and a bunch of other things. So,
which makes sense. Yeah, you're used to a nice quiet boreal forest, and you just hear. Fair enough. I don't blame them.
Yeah.
So what is the waterfowl, or what is, like, you guys deal mostly with it's waterfowl for the most part, right? Like, you're not dealing too much with the songbirds and that kind of stuff?
We've had a fair amount of collaboration with songbird researchers too.
So collaboration, but gotcha.
And a lot of our international partnerships, the North American Waterfowl Conservation Act, looking at migration of not only waterfowl, but they're increasingly looking at songbirds as well.
Gotcha. Okay. So what is the situation like, again, going back to the historical baseline thing? What is in relation to the historical baseline, as far as much as we know it, where are we sitting with waterfowl? I'm guessing that most species now that are, we've lost a certain percentage of them. What does that look like do you guys know?
For waterfowl?
For waterfowl, yeah.
Well, the numbers have trended up in recent years, actually. Okay. So our conservation efforts appear to be working, and there's changes in the nutrient availability in terms of food in the migration. Some of them, however, are in decline. The scaup and scoter are still in decline.
Right.
And some species go up in certain years, and some species go down.
It's give and take. Yeah.
We've had since the 1950s, the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service does transects across the Boreal, where they monitor the populations, and it's one of the best and longest kind of population survey in North America, besides the Christmas bird count on songbirds. So it's important information that we use to kind of track the trends of. And then there's huge numbers of geese coming from the Arctic that didn't used to, the populations were a lot lower. So there's a lot of different kind of dynamics of, in some cases, too many waterfowl in terms of the geese.
Oh, okay. Sure. Is that in relation to, like, now there's more geese than there was historically enough wetlands to sustain them, or is it just that there's actually more geese now than
there's more geese now? And with the rice and corn kind of residue, they're pretty.
So they're taking off with agriculture.
Pretty healthy birds arriving in the Arctic, and then they. If they get too overabundant, they can denude the landscape of all the rhizomes of the roots and things like that. So there's all kinds of different kind of complex challenges in waterfowl and conservation type things.
So the real concerns for you guys right now, like the really species at risk that you guys are kind of keying in on, which are those?
In terms of waterfowl?
Yeah, in terms of waterfowl.
Well,
for you guys.
I mean, I think that we are concerned about scaup and scoter, and it's really about maintaining the habitat for us.
And what's their habitat?
It's a very different kind of conservation approach than you would take for, say, a caribou, right?
Sure.
Because caribou have wide ranges and basically require a lot of intact habitat, whereas waterfowl are a little bit more resilient. So it's about maintaining those processes and maintaining those habitats across the landscape and ensuring that they're sufficient to keep the waterfowl populations strong in all those areas.
Right, and that's where the mapping comes in.
Yeah. And there increasingly are some, focus around things like yellow rail that are in decline.
Okay.
Critical species under Species at Risk Act, that they're going to be looking at more programs and things around. So still doing a lot of the research. U of A researchers are looking into that.
Yeah.
Aaron Bain and others.
Gotcha.
So, but yeah, there's in terms of critically endangered species, waterfowl are thankfully fairly abundant. So
that's good. Probably a lot thanks to ducks. I would have to guess.
Oh, we'd probably like to think so. But,
but But yeah, that was an interesting one too when I spoke with Mark Heckbert about the trumpeter swan too, right? He's like, this is one conservation win where it was down to a very critical level. I can't remember what the number was. And he's like, they're not out of the woods, but he's like, they're back up to a level where we're not as concerned anymore, which is huge. It's good to know that that's the case. I wonder what makes waterfowl so resilient to those changes, right? Whereas we have a lot of mammals that are seeing a harder time, right?
Yeah, well, I think waterfowl are they're different in how they settle, and some are more what you call plastic, or they can, like mallards, can adapt to different situations more, whereas scaup and scoter kind of require that intact boreal forest landscape to breed and nest and things like that.
Gotcha.
So there's some species that operate more under changing landscapes than others. So we're trying to understand that from, what are the main factors around that. But there are a lot of differences. But, waterfowl can, when they're settling, migrating north, they can kind of pick and choose and fly. So they can settle.
Those wings help a lot. Yeah.
A lot differently than, a caribou having to trudge through a bog and a fen. That they do range over wide areas.
Yeah.
But then they're also impacted more by the fragmentation and the predators, right?
Right.
So,
No, that totally makes sense.
But waterfowl are also impacted. We're just concluding a study on predators and the impact of that. And so we haven't seen the results yet, but we've been looking at that too. So that could be a bigger factor than we know right now. So
Gotcha. So the main predators of waterfowl, are we talking mostly like predation on eggs and like nesting and that kind of stuff?
Yeah.
Or okay. Yeah. Or other birds as well, I'm sure.
Well, any of those can happen. There are a number of species that prey on waterfowl. So
right. Okay. Yeah. So jumping ahead a little bit, I figured we should talk a little bit about. We've mentioned climate change a bunch of times.
Yeah.
So let's get into that. So what are the roles that like wetlands have when it comes to climate change and helping to mitigate climate change?
I think the big one is, like we talked about, carbon sequestration. Oh, it's a hard word to say.
Sequestration.
Sequestration. When you're on a podcast. But just the amount that it's storing is enormous, right? Especially across northern Canada and both Arctic and northern regions across the world where we have peatland, extensive peatlands.
Can you speak to that? Like, can you put that into something that people can visualize?
Yeah, we have these great maps, not just the products we're developing, but these maps that basically illustrate the distribution of wetlands across northern regions. And there's some extensive regions where the landscape is basically wetland. Right. It's to some degree storing or moving water at some point during the year, right? So by definition, it makes it a wetland.
Yeah.
But really, when you're thinking of climate change, it's those peatlands that are the most important, right? For how much carbon they're storing in greenhouse gases.
Yeah.
And now there was the previous point that I wanted to bring up before. We were talking about just carbon storage and peatlands, and especially as you go more north where you have permafrost across the landscape. We're kind of seeing this feedback, right, where the earth is getting warmer and warmer, and so more peatlands, for example, are losing their permafrost and their stores of frozen soil, which is releasing more greenhouse gases and carbon, right? So it's this kind of crazy feedback we're having.
So like I've seen that on the like way north and like I'm not even sure where.
NWT
and stuff, where you see it literally the permafrost is actually like melting and falling into the ocean type thing.
Oh yeah, as you go into the Arctic,
into the Arctic and stuff,
shorelines, and
how is the carbon being released there? So you just have permafrost, right?
Yeah.
So how does the permafrost? How is that holding on to the carbon? Because the peat is still there, right? It's like the peat is going away, right? So what's the mechanism there?
I don't know how to describe
I think as the permafrost melts, there's a lot of carbon and even like frozen gases that are in that permafrost that then once it melts that gets released.
So it's okay. So it's the carbon obviously is still held in the peat, but there's the stuff that's in the actual permafrost itself.
Yeah,
and that's a large amount apparently.
And also the kind of processes of decomposition, which also release carbon into the atmosphere. More of that happens when it's warmer and exposed. Whereas if it's frozen, it stays in, it's stored.
It's locked in. That makes sense. Okay.
Yeah. So there are a bunch of different processes that are happening, and that's why we're trying to ensure that, you know, the if you have, for instance, seismic lines, they can be areas where the permafrost is melting around those areas. So restoring the vegetation, excuse me, on those landscapes is really important.
Right, because you put a seismic line in, you get rid of the vegetation above it, and all of a sudden you don't have that buffer keeping the cold air in. Is that kind of the idea? So like you open it up now, it's open to the sun, and it'll start to melt a little easier.
Yeah, it's like an insulation layer, right? That keeps it cold, like a cooler or something. Yeah,
for sure.
Styrofoam, right? Like that would keep the cool in and keep the warmth out.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah, and places like the Northwest Territories is where we're seeing quite the largest impacts of just changes in permafrost extent, which is really drastically impacting actually wetland extent. And actually in some regions, so you can indicate that there's a lot of wetland expansion because you're seeing the loss of permafrost, right? And maybe at first you might think, well, that's fantastic, we want more wetlands, right? But it's the release of greenhouse gases and carbon and storage, and so it's not as thumbs up as you'd think, right?
Yeah,
but
it's not like we want to just like maximize all wetlands. It's like, no, there is a balance to be had there as well, right? So
and so it's really like if you think of how permafrost is laid out across Canada, you can kind of come across different zones where you have no permafrost, discontinuous, continuous, and it's that kind of middle discontinuous zone where it's not completely across the landscape, but you're seeing a lot of warming there where impacts are quite drastic.
Right. And so then what you were saying, the very first thing you said when we started talking about this was that as this permafrost is melting, it's releasing more carbon that has been locked up for God knows how long.
Exactly.
Right. And that is only adding to the carbon, adding to the heating, and just creating this kind of runaway effect where it just keeps getting worse and worse and worse and worse. Okay.
So
yeah,
it's a little scary.
That's always
to think
fun.
About. Yeah.
So how does? Yeah, so that's just like a climate. That's just a greenhouse gas thing.
Exactly.
That's beyond. That's a whole. The whole Earth has got to get on board with that one, right? Like that's not something you can like. All right, we're going to put a tarp over top of all of the...
Right, yeah. Well, I mean, you can start with smaller impacts, such as, linear features and seismic lines and, knowing where to put your development and roads and such, so you can kind of feed that back into there, right?
Gotcha.
Yeah.
No, that makes sense. So how does the... I might just be stupid today, but I'm trying to figure out... The problem with roads, like besides... So, like, what exactly is the problem with roads when it comes to these? Like, say you build a road across, like a wetland, like a bog or a fen or something like that, right? And it's like a winter road, right? So it's one that it's only they're only building it over the frozen ground. It's not going to be. They're not building like a highway that's totally blocking off all water flow and that kind of stuff. Is the concern there just reclamation so that that vegetation comes back and there's no compaction? Is that the concern, or is there more to it than that?
No.
Well, I think there is typically compaction
for sure.
You
drive a bunch of heavy trucks over it, it's going to compact at some point.
Yeah. A lot of the winter road wetlands are designed so that with pads or things underneath that. Minimize the compacting of the road itself, and a lot of those winter roads are taken out then at the end, and then everything typically, depending on how it's done, reverts back to the situation that it was eventually before that, before the road was put in. And so that's part of the sustainable forest management of planning the blocks, where you plan the blocks to harvest, and then how you put those roads in.
Yeah.
And as long as they're not, blocking the hydrology, which they wouldn't in the winter. Right. But there is also, for that period when they are in, it is access, for predators and things like that.
For sure. Yeah. So then when it comes to permanent roads, so building the permanent road across a wetland, I'm guessing right now the major concern is that there was like previous culverts and that kind of thing were not sufficient for water flow. Or I mean, when you got a giant fen that's a kilometer width and you got a road going perpendicular through it, you can't really create one giant. So like what's the proper way to do that? If you had to build a permanent road across one big fen or a big bog or something like that, where there's water flowing, what is the best practice? Because you guys have been working on that kind of stuff, right?
Yeah. So the first step, I think, is avoidance, right? So a lot of times, if we've been working a lot with forest companies around, when they plan roads and things to go in, they start to know not only from the wetlands, but the surficial geology. So if there's heavy clays, that they'll have a lot of economic interest, I guess, in doing the roads in the right places, because then it costs them 10 times the amount going through those areas that are seeping water continuously than it would to, put the road slightly. Might be counterintuitive because it's a little bit longer road, but it's on different soils and different position in the landscape and away from wetlands that, makes it easier in the long run with the kind of added maintenance cost of that road.
Yeah.
And you're helping to make sure that the flow of wetland, the hydrologic flow is not impeded.
Yeah, for sure.
And this is really where wetland mapping and land cover mapping comes, quite in handy, right?
Right.
One of our products that is really well received by industry is, once our group develops wetland and land cover maps, we can develop these products that are basically risk assessment, spatial maps of where it would be best to avoid, mitigate, where it would be best to put in a road or a linear feature. So it's there's a lot of benefits from that.
For sure.
Mm-hmm.
Is there, knowing the boreal forest and that we can have extensive fens that go on forever, right? So trying to go around it, let's say going around it's not possible, but for whatever reason they're going to go through it and get to the other side. Is there a way to build a permanent road in a situation like that where you can minimize the impact?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's proper culverts, and then there's also, depending on how long the road's going to be in, if it's a semi-permanent road, you can do things like corduroy, where you pile up sticks and then have fabric on top,
right,
and the water flows underneath the road, and then you pull that off at the end,
right,
and it's less of an impact, and that's been done for a long time. In terms of there are areas where you will have to cross a fen, and so there are a number of ways to kind of engineer that so that basically there's fens flow kind of through. Sometimes it's expressed on the surface, so you need some, but just making sure there is a lot of flow through underneath in the other parts of the soil in fens. It's not just, like a river.
Yeah, it's water table flow. It's underneath. Yeah, for sure. No, that makes sense. Yeah, it was just one of those ones where I'm thinking about culverts that I've seen. Like I remember one of my summer jobs was looking at, was doing culvert assessments and stream assessments and that kind of stuff, and where there would be a problem with, and it seemed like it was pretty common to come across like a hanging culvert, or like an improperly installed, or just been in there too long that the water's managed to, water wins every time if you wait long enough. Yeah. So it seems like it was pretty common that there's these culverts out there that kind of got forgotten about or whatever, and they end up being totally useless for most of the time because they're done improperly. So is there like new protocols going into that kind of stuff? Or is there new, like, those best practices that you guys were working on? Have those been updated to try and make it easier for them to understand how to build these properly, so that they don't have to go back every 5 years and fix the hanging culvert or that kind of stuff, right?
Yeah. So we work with some other engineers that are basically forest engineers that have really developed some better techniques of how you would do that, to ensure that, because it is a very common thing to have a hanging culvert when you have freeze thaw and the weight of the trucks on the road and all those types of factors.
Yeah.
So there's different engineering techniques and we have a guide that we've developed with those engineers of basically showing better ways of building those. So it's a little handbook that person building the road in the operations of forestry could look at this and say, oh, okay, yeah, we'll do this way, and that not always 100% guaranteed, because
sure,
in any situation, nature wins, as you say, but better ways of ensuring that those roads maintain flow and those culverts are functional for a longer period.
Yeah. Oh, that makes sense.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. So what's your guys' like your number one, I'm sure we talked about it, but your number one biggest concern as the Boreal program, when you look at the Boreal in the current situation, what's what's the big thing that you guys are focusing on to try and make sure that, wetlands are conserved? And
well, we have a 3-prong approach, and the first one is establish those protected areas, and then the second is ensure sustainable land use across the zone, and then the third one is really working on wetland and conservation policies to ensure that those landscapes are intact and functioning the way that they, for all those ecological goods and services that we enjoy from the Boreal, remain into the future.
Right. So just looking at the whole thing. I'm guessing wetlands are the same as the rest of the Boreal forest. They're probably not historically a static system, right?
No, they're constantly changing. They always have, and they always will. Yeah.
So that's an interesting one, talking about, like, when you say conservation, when you talk about a changing system, right? I think there's a lot of organizations out there that look at conservation as what they really want is preservation and not necessarily conservation. You know what I mean? They're not interested in having this system change into something it would be. They want it to be, let's leave this like this forever. No people kind of thing, right? Yeah. And like, for me, that's not really doable. It doesn't really make sense, especially considering that the Boreal forest in general is a dynamic system, constantly changing. I mean, a fire comes through. I'm sure fire must have huge impacts on wetlands and water flow and that kind of stuff. I'm sure this isn't just an upland. You know what I mean? It's not just a vegetation issue, right?
Yeah, and that's why we work on the scale that we do on large landscapes, right? So you're kind of betting into the future of, here are the areas that will remain as, say, refugia or safe places or good habitats into the future. You're kind of hedging your bets around, by doing protection and sustainable development and policy, you're kind of mitigating, concern about a very small kind of postage stamp that you want to keep forever. And the other important point that I think that we focus on in our efforts is that kind of relationship with the land. That there has to be a healthy relationship there. And a lot of our Indigenous partners have had that healthy relationship for tens of thousands of years and have a lot of knowledge around that. And so we work actively with Indigenous partners to, kind of learn from that and understand that, but incorporate that into how we do our conservation efforts across the landscape.
Yeah, absolutely. That's a huge one, right? That's one that I point out too often, is that when, like, say, a lot of these hardcore NGO groups that are very much about like making everything into a park, like no people, no nothing, right? And it's like, that can be good for certain situations, but the truth is, I mean, you look at like Jasper National Park or Banff National Park, right? And it was like you said, right? It was a lot of Indigenous groups living there for tens of thousands of years, or whatever, 13,000 years. And all of a sudden we come in the 1900s, we're like, hey, get the hell out of here in the name of conservation. And it's like, well, they've been doing this for a while. They kind of know. So it's good to see that people are starting to open up to the idea of that traditional knowledge and see that coming back on, right? But more to my point, I guess, was that I personally feel like it's not unreasonable to say that the Boreal forest is one that developed with like Indigenous people, right? Like, it was one that became what it was because of their interaction on the landscape, especially considering all of the burning that they did, right? To keep plains open for bison and to do for berry picking, for making baskets, for all kinds of stuff, right? They were constantly managing the landscape for any number of reasons. And so for us to come in and think that, like, well, just let the forest be a forest, leave it alone, don't worry about it. It's like, well, that's not the way it was historically. But we have this weird idea that the forest will take care of the forest. And like, sure, yeah, it's in some sense of the word, but we're removing a key aspect, which was that Indigenous involvement, right?
Yeah.
And I think that's been kind of superseded now by, like, you know what I mean, by colonial society's involvement. But I feel like they're there can be some marriage there of trying to learn from them and trying to do things the way they did things in order to create a better future, right? Instead of just being terrified of being involved and screwing it up, right? So it's,
So there's Parks Canada this year had their first kind of indigenous protected conserved area and national park in Tydenny-Nene in the Northwest Territories. And so I think that model is really expanding, and also the establishment of the Indigenous Guardians Network, where it's Indigenous youth that are connecting with elders to advance conservation and a bunch of other things.
Yeah.
Really important program that we support and work with. And we had a lot of the youth guardians up in helping us with our field work, and they would kind of tell us about what's going on, their relationship with the land, and how the processes work in the area that we're mapping. Makes for better maps for us. And then they get experience, with geographic information systems and satellite information and all that. So it's a two-way learning.
Totally. There's so much to be learned there, right?
Yeah, we've had some great opportunities recently with working with different Indigenous groups and on our mapping efforts. And there has really been that effort to kind of merge science and traditional ecological knowledge, because there's just so much that both can learn from, right? And we've had these just great examples of working in the field and learning about that history of the landscape that they can help us learn about, right?
Oh, totally.
It's been some great working examples, and a lot of our work recently has been generated up in the North and Northwest Territories, and working with Quechua and Decho Indigenous groups, and we're seeing great uptake in the products that we're developing to help with land use planning and other conservation efforts on the landscape. And it's been a really good, you can call it a two-way learning street on both sides. Just it's been fantastic so far. Yeah,
it's awesome to see that that's happening now, right? Because I think it was easy to just I don't know what the hell happened in our history, but
right,
it's great to see that that's coming back, and we're starting to recognize our own hubris as a society and being like, hey man, maybe we don't know everything. Maybe we should talk to the people who've been here a while, right? Like
longer than us, right? Yeah, exactly.
So it's definitely it's awesome to see for sure. And then kind of going back to that idea of like conservation versus preservation, how do you guys build that into the model of wetland conservation, right? Like, so like I was saying before, whereas instead of being like, hey, this is a wetland, leave it as a wetland, don't touch it, don't do whatever, like don't let it convert. If it starts converting, we got to make sure it doesn't convert like on its own, let's say, right? How do you build in the idea of a plastic landscape into like wetland ecology and that kind of stuff?
Good question.
Well, I think, one is really that is understanding the science. So how are the impacts of wetlands from climate change and anthropogenic impacts? What is that? And understanding the science behind it. Yep. So then you can use that science-based approach to develop the conservation practices and approaches with industries and government and people so that they can maintain that relationship with the land. So it's really closing that knowledge gap and developing your conservation programs to be more, like using or working with the Indigenous guardians.
Sure.
And hiring them on your projects because then you're working with the community who already have that relationship with the land.
Yep.
And you're developing that into, it's not us telling Indigenous groups where they should protect. It's us providing the information to support what decisions they make around conservation, or working with industry to provide the information so that they can figure out how best to extract the resource and maintain the conservation on the landscape.
Yeah, for sure. Well, that makes sense. Because I guess I was thinking about like say like beaver dams or something like that, right? Where you have this river, right? And then you got a beaver comes through and puts in a dam, and that creates it's a dam for whatever 50 years or something like that, and then it creates its own ecology, and then it washes out and it changes, right? So it's creating this. Those wetlands are it seems like they're the beginning of that plastic part of the boreal forest, right? Like they're very much changing the ecology in a huge way. Mm-hmm. So to allow for that, you have to allow for that kind of change, those changes to happen, and I'm sure it's just within a certain degree of variation. You're just keeping an eye on it, I guess, right?
Yeah.
So yeah,
Yeah.
I think it depends where we have kind of a two-sided relationship with beaver, right? Because, in the Boreal where you have lots of space and, in those areas, they provide really important habitat for species like green-winged teal.
Okay.
The ponding creates the small, and it's usually a lot of nutrients, so they're very productive systems, that type of thing. But where we've created a wetland and we kind of want to maintain that full supply level for legal reasons with the agreements that we signed with landowners, then you get a beaver that raises it up even further.
Yeah.
Then we have to actually go in and make sure that we have to tear down the dam and do active work, habitat asset management, we call it. So it depends on the situation, but we have a different relationship in different areas with how we look at beavers.
I think pretty much everybody that's in landscape management in some form or other has a dual relationship with beavers, right?
Yeah, for sure.
They're ecological engineers, but they're also a pest at times.
Yeah.
When you're trying to maintain a road and
yeah,
it's flooding over and things.
Yeah, there's a give and take there for sure.
Yeah. And
Awesome.
you keep making the reference of just kind of having this plastic boreal landscape that's ever changing, right? And it really pushes the this need for updates on data and information, and for example, land cover mapping, right?
For sure, absolutely.
And just as a little background to it, we're kind of in my field right now, we're at the forefront of a technological boom, essentially, in remote sensing technology.
Yeah.
Whether it's more satellites, resolution, cloud computing, etc. So we're kind of at this point where we're getting better at able to do refreshes and more with higher accuracy. So and it could feed these these different processes that we're trying to help with, whether it's land use planning or different conservation efforts. The more accurate and more refresh we have these data layers, the better we can look to understand and conserve certain aspects of the landscape.
Oh yeah, no, good data means good management, right?
Exactly, right?
Yeah, you can't.
That's exactly, yeah.
You shit in, shit out.
Exactly, yeah.
So,
people say why wetland mapping, but you know, you need that good input, right?
Yeah, no, you need to do it right. So that totally makes sense, and that's my day job, right? Is not with wetlands, but with the forest cover, right? So I totally get that for sure. Yeah, that's the beginning of all good management tools, right? Is first of all, what do we got? Now what?
Yeah,
right?
exactly.
So,
then your models work a lot better.
Yeah, no kidding. Yeah, for sure.
Yeah.
So, do you guys have anything to leave us on kind of a good note? Do you guys have any specific success stories or something that you think is really good? Points out the strengths of ducks and what you guys can do and what's possible when it comes to wetland restoration or conservation.
Yeah, I alluded to earlier just on our recent projects up in the Northwest Territories, and we've developed these great working relationships with the Acacho and Decho indigenous groups, and we maintain these really great relationships, and we're helping with land use planning processes and other things we're working on in the landscape, right?
Yeah.
So we've had relationship development, we've had field campaigns where we been able to work with indigenous youth and really kind of learn from both our groups and theirs.
Yeah.
And we've seen the success of developing these wetland spatial products across extents that we haven't been able to do before, right?
Yeah, for sure.
So, in saying that, we've expanded our mapping team, and we have a great team of analysts. So a lot of success all around, but there's been a lot of great uptake of our work and products up in the north right now. So
that's awesome.
It's nice to see that those growing relationships.
That's good. Do you guys see us we're going in the right direction when it comes to wetland conservation and that kind of stuff? Or are you seeing, there's always going to be challenges, but do you think that as a society we're heading in the right direction?
I think it's tracking quite a bit, with the impacts of climate change and a lot of those other pieces that are kind of, pretty at the forefront of the, political discussion and a bunch of other aspects. It is becoming more and more, people are more and more aware. And, if people want more information on, both the success stories and, how wetland conservation is advancing, you can visit our website at boreal.ducks.ca. And we have a bunch of stories about our success stories, and our team's on there if you want to contact us. And we also have a fair amount of information there on wetlands. We do a lot of wetland training that type of thing. So,
Right.
A lot of resources for industry and government and other partners. So
Yeah, I guess that was my last question. There was kind of how do people get involved? How do people, you know what I mean, show their support for, you know, the work that you guys do?
Mm-hmm. Well, we were talking earlier about kind of one of the easiest things to do that just doesn't happen as much as it should is just getting out into the Boreal. You know, I found just, you know, as I started working across Canada's north in these beautiful, unique regions that a lot of people have just not visited them, so they're kind of not aware of kind of what they behold, right? And their
For sure.
just their beauty and everything, not just their you know, what we're talking about today, the you know, the impacts on climate, et cetera, you name it, water. Just getting out and seeing what that landscape is, you'll probably see that as a great feedback coming back of, wow, I really should pay more attention to these systems and these parts of my country that are really impacting, you know, my day-to-day life, whether it's climate, water,
For sure.
flood, et cetera, right?
Absolutely.
and connecting to the global importance that wetlands in the Boreal have, right? Like we were talking earlier, it's incredibly important on a number of levels, and not only the immense beauty and scope and scale, and you know, Michael and I have had really good opportunity to fly around. We've probably seen more of the Boreal than most flying, you know, a lot of these projects that we work with partners, and
For sure.
incredibly beautiful landscapes. You know, I think Canadians and international folks are well acquainted with the Banffs and Jaspers and Niagara Falls of places, but there's some as incredible, if not even more so, areas across the Boreal that may be a little bit harder to get to, but they're worth it once you do. So really about connecting people to the Boreal and the incredible values that are there out there.
I totally agree. I have an example of a buddy of mine who we both went to school here in Edmonton, and then he moved down to Calgary and got into, you know, he's hanging out in a lot of the public land use zones and in the parks and stuff like that. And he got into hunting, and he started talking. He's like, I got this like amazing, this public land, like right next to Calgary. It's over here. It's awesome. And all this kind of stuff. I'm like, that's great. And he's like, yeah, we should, like, why don't we do more public land hunting? And I'm like, you've been coming up to Slave Lake for the last 3 years. There's nothing but public land. I was like, the whole northern half of Alberta is mostly public land, right? But people don't know that, because I think most people probably most of the population of Alberta, I don't know how much, but probably most of them have never been past Edmonton, right? Or even a lot of them probably never went past Calgary, let alone like Edmonton, right? So there's a lot of land up there that's incredible, and there's a lot of resources, a lot of value that, like you said, it's just not being recognized. I think one of the big points is, like, you always see in the news anytime something's happening in the Amazon, right? It's just like the Amazon's burning, the Amazon's this, the Amazon's our biggest contiguous forest, or it's our biggest whatever carbon sequestrator or whatever it is, right? And you look at all those things and you're like, okay, first of all, none of the things you just said are true, because the Boreal trumps the Amazon and all of those things. But it's never something. It's not this jungle crazy monkeys and that kind of stuff floating around, so it doesn't get that attention, right? It's weird that we've just, as a society, we've almost negated the importance of this massive piece of forest land that goes across the northern part of the globe, right? Like it's weird that we're just it's
the best untold story, I think, out there is the Boreal and the relationships that people have on the land and the, you know, incredible values. It really is an untold story. It needs to be told more. So thank you for the opportunity.
I'll try to. It is weird.
Podcast
for sure.
helps.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, this is awesome, guys. You guys have any final thoughts? Anything you want to throw out there to just finish it off?
Go see the Boreal.
Go see the Boreal. There you go.
There you go. Yeah.
Awesome.
No, thanks for the opportunity. It's
absolutely
been
much
a great
appreciated
discussion today, and great to talk about our program and what we do.
Awesome.
Really appreciate it.
Yeah, no problem, guys. Thanks a lot. Thanks a lot for listening, guys. I hope you enjoyed that. I'm so grateful to have had to speak to Kevin and Michael about the importance of wetlands and their perspective. It's always great to learn new stuff. I hope you guys learned something today. Thanks a lot for listening. Take it easy. We'll catch you guys next time.